Hey everyone, and welcome to This Explainer. I am absolutely thrilled you're here today because we're taking a fresh look at one of the most famous texts in human history, the Ten Commandments. Now, I know what you might be thinking. Most of us just pictured this simple, maybe kind of rigid list of disconnected rules carved onto stone tablets like you'd see in an old movie. But what if I told you there is an incredibly brilliant, beautifully symmetrical architectural design hiding right there in plain sight? Today, we're going to decode that symmetry together and uncover the profound moral and spiritual vision it actually reveals. Okay, let's dive right in. Take a look at this quote. It perfectly captures what we're talking about. The commandments are not random. They are arranged almost musically. Now, I want to say right up front and with total humility that Scripture doesn't explicitly spell out this structural symmetry for us. You're never going to find a verse that says, hey, the first commandment parallels the 10th. Instead, these are really careful interpretive observations that scholars and theologians have pieced together over centuries. But as you'll see, these structural patterns are just so deliberate and so compelling. They reveal a depth to this ancient text that is literally breathtaking. Section 1. Beyond a list of rules. The ancient covenant structure. So to really get this, we've got to look at the historical context. The Ten Commandments aren't just random moral sayings tossed together. They are formalized covenant terms between God and humanity, and they closely mirror what historians call suzerain treaties. Basically, these were ancient Near Eastern agreements between a massive, powerful king and his subjects. Notice the structure here. It always begins by identifying the ruler, then it gives a historical prologue, lays out the stipulations, and so on. This wasn't just for show. In ancient Hebrew culture, arranging things this way was absolutely crucial for memorization, for public recitation, and for deep theological interpretation. The order means everything. And that actually brings us to a massive pop culture misconception. If you ask practically anyone to picture the two stone tablets, they almost always imagine 5 rules squished onto the left tablet and 5 on the right, right? But historically speaking, that's completely a myth. Ancient covenant treaties actually kept duplicate copies of the entire agreement. You had one full copy for the ruler and one full copy for the vassal. Since both of these tablets were placed inside the Ark of the Covenant, it meant that, symbolically, both parties' copies were kept right there together in God's presence. So the crucial point is, even before we get into the really deep literary symmetry, there's this massive conceptual symmetry right on the surface. The commandments divide perfectly into 2 major halves. The first part dictates our vertical relationship, meaning our love toward God. The second part dictates our horizontal relationship, our love toward others. And if that sounds super familiar, it's because it maps perfectly onto how Jesus later summarized the entire law. Love God and love your neighbor. Section 2. The symmetrical mirrored pairs. Reflections of the heart. Let's look at what scholars call the chiasm theory. This is where the commands basically act as parallel reflections of one another. Now, what's really interesting here is how the first and last commandments actually create a frame around the whole text. Think about it. The first commandment, no other gods, demands external allegiance. But the 10th commandment, no coveting, exposes our internal allegiance. Because coveting isn't just, wanting your neighbor's new car. It's assigning ultimate value to something outside of God's will. It's essentially internal idolatry. So the whole covenant begins and ends with the heart. And the pattern just keeps going with the 2nd and 7th commandments, no idols and no adultery. Now, why on earth do these mirror each other? Because both of these commands protect faithful, exclusive intimacy. In fact, if you read the prophetic writings of the Bible, idolatry is repeatedly described as adultery. An idol is a false union of spiritual worship, right? In the same way that adultery is a false union of covenant love. One protects spiritual fidelity, and the other protects marital fidelity. Neither relationship can survive divided loyalty. Then we have the 3rd and 8th commands, misusing God's name mapped parallel to stealing. In ancient Hebrew thought, God's name represented his character, his authority, his whole covenant identity. To use it in vain wasn't just saying a bad word. It was misrepresenting him or using his identity manipulatively. So while the 8th commandment forbids stealing someone else's physical property, the 3rd commandment is basically forbidding spiritual identity theft, stealing God's sacred reputation for your own selfish gain. They are both profound violations of trust. Now hold on a second. I want you to really think about this next one. What could taking a day of rest on the Sabbath possibly have to do with lying? It seems like a completely random pairing, doesn't it? While scholars point out that breaking the Sabbath is actually an existential lie, by refusing to rest, you're essentially living as if Pharaoh still rules over you, or as if your survival depends 100% on your own frantic striving. You're acting as if God isn't the provider. Meanwhile, the ninth commandment, false witness, is a literal verbal lie that corrupts truth in the courts, so both of these preserve truth and justice. One protects the community from spoken lies, and the other protects us from the systemic lie of endless, unredeemed labor. And right at the very center of human relational ethics, we find the fifth and sixth commandments. Honor your parents and do not murder. Parents are the source, the channels of life. So to honor them is to honor life's origin positively. Murder, on the flip side, is the ultimate destruction of life. It's a direct assault on the image of God. Together, these two sit incredibly tightly together, declaring an absolute, non-negotiable reverence for human life. Because when that reverence disappears, society literally collapses. Section 3. The heart of the pattern. Progressing inward. Let's step back and see how this builds. If we zoom out from those pairs and just read the text sequentially, there is an incredible step-by-step movement inward. Step 1 starts totally outward with worship. No idols. Step 2 moves inward a bit to sacred time and authority, the Sabbath and honoring parents. Step 3 governs social justice, murder, adultery, theft. And finally, step 4 pierces right into the invisible realm of inward desire, coveting. The law penetrates progressively deeper and deeper. It proves that this text is perfectly anticipating a massive biblical truth that all outward sin ultimately originates in the human heart. And right in the middle of this structural masterpiece is the Sabbath. In this chiastic structure, the Sabbath acts as the absolute pivot point. Think about it. It is the longest, most detailed commandment by far. It ties all the way back to creation and to liberation from slavery. Human rebellion started in Eden with a fundamental distrust of God, right? But the Sabbath completely restores that trust. By actually stopping our labor and depending on God, the Sabbath becomes the exact hinge upon which this entire covenant swings. Which brings us to Section 4, a blueprint for restoration, reversing the fall. And this brilliantly illustrates how these commandments aren't just cold, primitive restrictions designed to ruin everyone's fun. They are a literal rescue plan. After Eden, humanity completely unraveled. We desired another god, we distorted the truth, we coveted, and eventually that led to murder with Cain. Well, the Ten Commandments systematically reverse engineer that exact unraveling. They restore pure worship, they restore truth through the Sabbath, they bring back contentment, and they demand reverence for life. It is a complete blueprint for a reordered, restored humanity. So, what is the ultimate takeaway from all of this? Simply put, God isn't merely trying to manage our behavior. You cannot separate your worship from your justice, or your internal desires from your outward behavior. It's a package deal. Idolatry affects your marriage. Coveting wrecks your worship. Dishonor destroys life. We live in a completely interconnected moral universe. This overarching brilliant structure reveals that God desires whole, integrated hearts, not just people checking off a list of external rules. Which leaves every single one of us with a pretty challenging reflection. Are you settling for outward rule-keeping, or are you actively building a deeply integrated heart? The Ten Commandments push us to realize that, sure, we can fake external obedience all day long, but true righteousness? That's about our hidden loyalties, our loves, and who we actually trust. I really hope this explainer has completely transformed how you view this ancient, beautiful text, and I hope it leaves you eager to dig even deeper into it. Thank you so much for learning with me today.